Hello, it's Brad Laurie of BlockchainBrad, and today I'm talking with Nick Platias. He's the head researcher of Terra. If you don't know what that stands for, it's about changing the game when it comes to blockchain money, or more importantly, decentralized money for the globe. Nick, thank you very much for being here to explain, firstly, what your role is, who you are, and what you do as you lead out their research at Terra.
Absolutely, it's my pleasure to join. So, quick primer on Terra. So I'm not sure if the audience is familiar. The gist of it is we are building a decentralized stablecoin, which also we plan to use as a means of payment at scale. So our go-to-market is geared towards e-commerce. We have partnerships with a large number of e-commerce companies in East and Southeast Asia. And recently, actually, we launched our we had a partnership with a Korean payments company called Chai, which uses the Terra blockchain. So essentially, transactions on the Chai payment gateway go through Terra. And Chai has been live for about 10 days, and it already has 100,000 users. So basically, 100,000 users are already transacting on Terra.
Wow! So 10,000 a day, roughly. That's pretty fast moving. That's really impressive. And obviously, as you said, you're really focused in that Asian region of the globe right now. I would imagine that will expand given the uptake there. But let's pull it back. One of the reasons why I wanted to catch up with you today is to really look at the article that you wrote, explore some of the contrasts and comparisons with Libra. So for those who are not familiar, Nick did write a really comprehensive article. I'll certainly put the link in below. And this is entirely free as well. It's really important that people do understand that this is all about trying to provide information for the people. And I also do want to say that there might be a donation for me later. And that is a discussion that is happening right now just to contribute to my channel, but I want to be fully transparent that there's certainly no definite money exchange to do this. I do want to know more with Nick. Now, Nick, one of the things that, in your article you explain in detail is some of those contrasts with Libra, as I was saying. But let's pull it back first to the problems that you see more generally, in the space that really incentivize the existence of something like Libra or Terra.
Right. So I think the motivation and the vision between the two projects, and to be absolutely clear, I'd be referring to Libra as the initiative, which Facebook is a founding member, but absolutely not Facebook, the company. And also there's a Facebook subsidiary called Calibra, which essentially is building the internal services within Facebook to interface with the Libra blockchain. So things like a wallet for users, payments, etc. But that's all Facebook based. But speaking of the initiative, that is Libra and Terra, I'd say that the motivation is very aligned. So the two key problems that we came in to solve when we started about a year and a half ago were, number one, the volatility problem in crypto. So basically, we've all seen the roller coaster ride of Bitcoin and the rest of the market, right?
Especially now, Nick, perfect time to say that, because just in the last week, it's been crazy.
Oh, it has, yeah. So some attribute that partly to Libra, and we can touch that upon later. Okay. Because it's an interesting question to ask. What does Libra mean for the general crypto space, and also what does Libra mean for stablecoins in particular? So what could be? Yeah. So number one is the price volatility problem, right? If you want to have real world adoption, then it's very hard to transact with a currency whose value could change anyway. Right? And so number one, we saw that as a core problem to solve. And then number two was the lack of real world use cases. So a few minutes ago, we were talking about basically how crypto has been all about trading, unfortunately, up until now.
Very much so. So speculation's been rife and very little empirical evidence of uptake in terms of real purpose, real use case.
Exactly, yeah. So I think those are the two fundamental problems that crypto has faced for a very long time.
Right. Now, do you think in that respect, though, Nick, that if had BTC not existed, beyond its Satoshian, concepts in that white paper, but more so what it evolved to be with the SOV, given its rife volatility, and that was just the start. We see many of them continue through, as you're saying. Had we not have seen these kind of iterations develop where volatility still reigned, do you think there would be any, was that the impetus, the incentive to really build out Terra, for example, by an observation of previous iterations that weren't working?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, it's sort of like a counterfactual, where like, what if Bitcoin had not existed?
Yeah.
Impossible to say, right? I mean, I would say that part of our vision is definitely aligned with Bitcoin, in the sense of having decentralized money that is not controlled by any given entity or government, right? No bank, no central bank, etc. So in that sense, we share a lot of that vision. And had Bitcoin never been created, God knows, there's a good chance Terra wouldn't be around.
But Nick, do you actually share it with BTC though, really? Because many would argue that the Satoshi and white paper is not the current the premise for BTC. So do you actually share the same premise? Because many would argue that BTC doesn't function as, you know, universal global money.
That's also an interesting point. So I fully agree with you that what Bitcoin is today and what was phrased in the original white paper have a fair amount of divergence. I think one could argue that the true essence of what Satoshi wanted to do has still lived on, and that being censorship resistant form of money that is not controlled by any individual entity or government. Basically, I think what Satoshi had in mind was, and if you look at the way it was written, was electronic cash. Right? So I'm pretty sure that's
peer-to-peer, you know, global cash. Pretty much.
Peer-to-peer electronic cash, right? Which obviously Bitcoin has failed to achieve, and it's obvious why, right? Because of the volatility problem we were talking about. It's very hard to have an everyday currency whose value can change dramatically. But I think this points to a more general observation, which is that what Bitcoin was initially envisioned to be and how it's evolved over time are two very different things, right? So I think Bitcoin has gone through several phases, including the store of value thesis, which has some credence, debatable. Then the thesis for crypto being independent asset class. So I think that has evolved a lot. And what I would say Terra shares with that vision is primarily the idea that we don't want to have a central entity or party that has full control over the money. Right? So
well said, very well said. And that's where we need to talk about Libra in this contrastive and comparative analysis, because it's exactly that point, that alignment of the centralized value with BTC and you as representative of Terra, that is actually converse to many of the constructs we're going to talk about with Libra. So let's go into that a little bit more. Now, one of the things that you did very well in your article, Nick, was you really explained some of the likenesses, the similarities, but you also went into detail about the differences. So let's start with the what of that. Perhaps we could start with the easier part, which is the similarities, because there's less of them.
Yeah, so I think one notable similarity that, to the best of my knowledge and memory, Terra doesn't share with any other stablecoin is the fact that both Terra and Libra are pegged to a basket of currencies.
Right.
So most other stablecoins, pretty much everyone that I can recall right now, is pegged to an individual nation's currency, be that the US dollar, be it the British pound, and so on. And so I think it's an interesting way of designing a global currency to peg to currency basket. Right? And of course, there's a trade-off there. The trade-off is that on the one hand, you're pegging to a unit of value that represents more of a global economy, right? So it moves not with a single economy, but with multiple economies to represent a big fraction of the world's GDP. But there's a big drawback to that approach, which is that when you want to use that currency as an everyday medium of exchange, it might work fine if people are holding it for a few hours or a couple of days. But if people actually want to hold onto that currency for weeks, months, or even years, so they use it even partially as store of value, then that could definitely cause problems, right? Because let's say that I'm a Japanese citizen and I hold, let's say Libra, for example, and I hold some Libra in my wallet, and say I hold $100 of Libra for a couple of years. Then I could end up losing a bunch of money or earning money, depending on the exchange rates of the Japanese yen with that basket of currencies.
Right. Now, in that respect, though, Nick, isn't that possibly a boon for your model, because you're not trying to espouse SOV, the store of value. You're more trying to espouse the use of this as a utility. And so, for that reason, doesn't it make more sense to have this basket approach? This multi approach.
So there's a couple of points there, right? So the first is, indeed, our focus for the time being is not at all to be a store of value. We want Terra to be something that you could hold for more than a few days. But the focus really is to become a medium of exchange at scale. Mm-hmm. But the second very key point that I also make in the article is the fact that Terra actually is not a single stablecoin, but a family of stablecoins. Mm-hmm. So what that means is we actually have a version of Terra for every local currency and local market in which we operate. For example, there already is Terra KRW, right? Where one Terra KRW is pegged to one KRW. And the big advantage of this is that it allows us to solve the problem that I mentioned, right? So as a Korean citizen, I know that I can hold Terra KRW and not be subject to exchange rate fluctuations.
Yes.
Which then might raise the question, so why have both, right? So it's sort of like, it might seem as if we want to both have a cake and eat it, in the sense that we both have local Terra currencies, but we also have a currency basket. And I think that's a broader discussion as to what an individual Terra user wants, right? So if I'm transacting on Tmon, which is the e-commerce company second largest in Korea, with which we partnered,
yes,
then I think it does make sense to use Terra KRW, because that's what the products are that you're buying for are denominated in.
Yes, and especially in Asia, you raised the point, we can discuss this later, but because, every region has preferences, culture very much aligns with economics in many respects. So, you've aligned with the interests of those governments, because they have currencies that represent their interests and their nation, their economies, and you're aligning with that. So I think that's the point you're making there.
Absolutely, yes. And so actually this is a key point, I think, with or a key distinction between what we're trying to do and what Libra could end up with. Because if you look at a lot of the backlash that they've received, because basically within 24 hours of the announcement, tons of regulators and governments have all lashed against them to warn them that they'll be regulated at the high standards. And I think the US, some commission from Congress basically ordered them to stop development until they get
Yes. Yes, it was certainly almost a level of FUD we'd never seen quite before, because it engaged, multinationals from many different countries. I mean, governments from all around the world were really standing up in arms about this issue. But one of the things I did want to talk to you, going back to one of the key distinctions, now that we're talking about the regionality that you mentioned in your article, is that the way in which Libra peg is a little different. They don't focus so much on the little currency, the local currency.
Yep.
So can you talk about that?
So I think they haven't released full details as to what that currency basket will be. Mm-hmm. And I think that's part of the threat. So what I was going to say earlier is that a lot of the governments revolted against the idea, and I think especially, I think it was the French Prime Minister or German Prime Minister, basically claimed that there's absolutely no way that they would allow Libra to become a competitor to sovereign currency. Right? Mm. And I think when you phrase it as an abstract currency basket that Facebook would have, or the association would have control of, then you are creating this new entity that could potentially compete. Mm. We're very careful to avoid that, and the goal for Terra is never to be a competitor to national currencies. So we either have individual pegged currencies, so the Terra KRW or the Terra USD, or we have the Terra SDR, which is pegged to the IMF currency basket, which is a standard that has existed for decades. And so again, we're trying to peg to basically a global standard that is not supposed to compete, but rather has been designed to be a global balanced currency basket.
It makes a lot of sense, Nick. And also the way Terra approached this, it seems like it was much more sequential. Again, not trying to shield Terra, we're literally trying to unpack this, but it seemed like there was a lot of forethought into making sure that you did satisfy the governments, in those regions, and you made sure that you're complementing, not challenging them. Whereas we see the counterpart with the Libra events of late, and it was really quite a shock for many because it was like a bull out of the gates. It was, a lot of people weren't ready. Those governments certainly were caught unawares. And so the reaction was very vehement and very aggressive. So do you feel that the way in which Terra have evolved has been much more planned in concert with interests, in the mainstream?
So truth is, this space is so changes so fast, and especially in the regulatory realm, most things are still in the gray zone. So I think we've tried hard to look ahead and to anticipate what the rules might be and do our best to play within the bounds. But you can never be perfect, right? Because when you don't know what the law is or what the law will be, then you can't be 100% sure that you will comply with what might come in the future.
Right. Well, what about engagement though, Nick, with the governments, for example? In Asia, you're in Korea. Is there dialogue between some of those economists within the government sector, for example? Because obviously they'd be, wanting to know more about what Terra is doing to make sure that you're not stepping on the toes of their own economic agenda.
So as far as I know, so Terra has received quite a lot of publicity in Korea. I'm not aware of specific discussions with the government, but I'm confident that Terra has been heard and discussed.
Okay.
And yeah, my feeling is that there is no perception that we're competitive because we've
right.
been that's it.
Okay, well, that's interesting. Now, with regard to some other similarities that you wrote, one of them was that you felt that both were open and inclusive financial systems. Do you stand by that? Do you think they're both truly open, given the things we're talking about with Libra, with Facebook, Cambridge Analytica illusions, centralization, control? Are they really both open?
So to clarify that statement, Dora was describing the vision rather than what will likely be the implementation. So if you read through Libra's white paper and if you read through their just their documentation and the marketing material that they've produced, it very much sounds like that's what they're aiming for, right? And so there, I tried to be clear in specifying that that was the vision that the Libra initiative, separately from Facebook, tried to present.
I see. To play the devil's advocate, Nick, again, not to shill Terra, but we've seen many different examples of white papers that have, eventuated to naught. They've just been simply beautifully written narratives that really haven't evolved into empirically evidenced truth or tried and tested technology. So it is, how can we trust these statements in the eloquence of the presentation?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely on point. So that was part of my effort to be as objective as possible and give them the benefit of the doubt. But yeah, I thought it was your job to be objective and my job to shill Terra, but it seems we've switched roles here.
Well, I'm just trying to play both sides, and obviously we'll try and explore as much as we can of both coins, or rather both projects, because we'll explore in a moment. You are a dual coin system, and so is Libra. But moving back to some of the other similarities, one of them was, and this is really interesting, permissionlessness, frictionless structures. Can we talk about that for a moment? Both of them are truly and authentically permissionless.
Absolutely not. I think, in fact, Libra has been transparent about the fact that in the beginning and for the first several years, it will very much be permissioned. So they are, the way their architecture will start is that there's this group of companies called the association. I think the goal is for them to be roughly 100. And basically what the chain will be in the beginning will be simply consensus within those 100 nodes. Right? So that is basically a completely closed system where, as an independent validator, I have no right to join. Right? Basically, for anyone to join that system, there needs to be approval from everyone else in the association. So that is by definition a permission system.
Right. So Nick, with all your technology, though, I want technology savvy and understanding as the head researcher. Surely, there's valid questions raised about, is this actually a blockchain in the sense of an active public system if it functions like a database initially?
I think that's an excellent point. I think at this point, it is probably more so a blockchain metaphorically than practice. In fact, I didn't dive too much into their consensus mechanism and the way the data is stored. understanding is that it does very much function like a sequential database where there's a version number corresponding to each transaction that has been processed. Okay. So in that sense, I agree with your statement that at this point, I don't think it's really a blockchain, and certainly not an open blockchain.
Right. Well, let's talk about Terra now. Now, you're permissionless from the outset, from my understanding. How do you differ, and to what degree, and with what objective?
Right. So the basic distinction between a permission and a permissionless system is who is allowed to join the consensus process, right? So Terra uses proof of stake. Yeah. And so what that would mean is who is allowed to set up a validator who will be participating in the consensus, which would mean the job of validator is, number one, to validate transactions that are proposed by other validators in the system. Mm-hmm. And number two, when elected, be the one who proposes transactions that he has collected and then get consensus from the remaining. So in a permissionless system, anyone should be able to participate in that. Mm-hmm. And that's what it means that there is no centrally controlling party, right? You don't need to ask for anyone. And of course, that's not the case with Libra, right? With Libra,
right, exactly. Well, what is the consensus? Do you know? What's the title of their consensus?
So I think they used it's a Byzantine fault tolerance system, and the basic premise there is that if at least 2/3 of the nodes in the system are honest, then you are able to basically resist a Byzantine attack where a subset of the nodes are malicious, right? And you're able to form consensus successfully.
Many of the systems that want to have few nodes do this, because it affords for greater control, less security risks, and more success. But it doesn't necessarily ease the way when you want to try and do things like sharding, or if you want to do things like expand the number of nodes to be more scalable. Now, in your design, one of the key features is security, or to imagine through the staking model, but also scalability. The absolute scale required for going global isn't necessarily millions of transactions, but it is substantial. How are you going to cope with that in your proof of stake model to be able to service the needs of Terra as you move out to be a globally transactable coin for that's borderless?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. So at the moment, given our architecture, we expect roughly 5,000 to 10,000 transactions per second. Mm-hmm. So that is slightly shy of what Visa is able to support.
Wow.
But given the transaction volumes that we expect in the foreseeable future, we think that 5,000 to 10,000 per second is probably more than enough. And there is ongoing development for us to potentially increase that if need arises.
So the throughput's meeting the needs of the demand that right now, and obviously there's room to develop this in time as you evolve, build, and then obviously Okay, that's good to know. Now, with regard to some of the fundamentals, we discussed the throughput. What about security? Many people talk about this as a concern, especially as you're trying to build literally money. How do people trust the blockchain that you've designed? And let's contrast that with Libra's design as well.
So I think when you're dealing with systems that use public key cryptography, right, where essentially your private key is your password to your money or your data, security really comes down to whether or not you trust the network in being resistant to attacks from malicious nodes, right? So for Bitcoin, for example, what security means is if at least 50% of the hash power of the network is controlled by honest nodes, then you expect that no malicious actor or group of actors will be able to take over the network. For example, double spending attacker. For Terra is also actually a Byzantine fault tolerance system. So that's a very general class of consensus algorithms, and Libra does happen to fall into that category as well. Mm-hmm. And essentially the guarantee that we make is that if at least 2/3 of the Luna in circulation, and quick reminder, Luna is the staking token for consensus. So if 2/3 of that Luna is controlled by honest nodes, then you are guaranteed that the network will be resistant to attacks, and it will function securely.
Okay.
Right? And basically, that is a threshold that we feel very comfortable with. So at this point, if you look at the foundation as well as the team and early investors, we basically know almost everyone who is a validator at this point. And so we do know that the vast majority of stake Luna is held by friendly parties. And of course, this will decentralize over time, but we feel quite confident based on the community that we've built that 2/3 is a very comfortable threshold.
I mean, it is a challenge, and it always is the case that there is a significant amount of trust placed on the initial core group, because that's and it's certainly the case with every blockchain that we see, where the Byzantine consensus is the predominant feature of it. But you're saying that the plan is to literally decentralize over time. We've seen that with Neo. We're yet to see it, emerge. But what, in terms of number and nodes right now, what are the kinds of numbers for Terra with regard to how you've secured the network?
So we're currently just shy of 2 months of operation for our mainnet, and we're more than 50 validators, I think 55.
Wow, that's pretty good. That's a lot more than Neo.
Yeah, we were very positively surprised by how quickly validators.
That's impressive. Now, what about Libra? Let's flip it on its head. What can you comment about with regard to security, with regard to trust? I mean, certainly, I would imagine that they're not looking to, with a vision of decentralization quite the same, despite that they want to move to permissionless designs.
Right, so security wouldn't be my number one concern. I mean, I think that there's enough economic incentive for Uber and Spotify and that group to behave honestly, right? But there's a difference between a system that is secure and a system that is permissionless, right? So I would expect it to be secure, but clearly when consensus needs to be agreed upon by a number of companies that all have pretty clear economic interests, and it's a very small group of companies, then clearly it's not hard to imagine how, I mean, that you could have censorship, right, and how the system works. And yeah, especially if, because all those are known entities, if there's a transaction or a set of transactions that governments are unhappy with, right, then they can tap on the door of Facebook and Uber and Spotify and give them a cease or desist unless they reverse the transaction, right?
Exactly.
So that wouldn't be hard to imagine, given that all the identities are known. With Bitcoin and with Terra, anyone can spin up a node and start mining, start validating, and the government doesn't really have a door to knock there.
Sure. Well, Nick, that has to the actual token model itself, or the token design. Now, as we were talking about before, they're both dual token models, but they're very different in what they are trying to do. Let's start with Terra. You have the Luna, as you said, and the Terra, distinguished for their utilities, but both utility.
So Terra and Luna operate very differently, and their objectives are very different. So for Terra, Terra is a stablecoin, and the objective for Terra is to be used as a medium of exchange. So I want to have peace of mind that Terra today and Terra tomorrow will be worth exactly the same amount.
Right.
Luna, on the contrary, is the staking token in the system. So basically, the way it operates is as a validator, I purchase some Luna, and then I stake it and I use it as voting power when it comes to the consensus mechanism.
Yes.
Right? So I vote for blocks and I approve blocks based on that voting power.
Yes, and what's interesting about that, I remember speaking with the CEO, I think at the time, and he was explaining that even though it was used as this to validate, to secure the network essentially through the staking, it's still regarded as a utility because it has core functionality. You absolutely need it for the ecosystem as a whole to operate. So it has value. But in that respect, I did want to ask you this, and it's a pretty tough question. There's always going to be speculators on Luna. So how do we remove how do you remove the discussion of speculation, of seeing it as some sort of volatile token of value that people can bet on, essentially? How do you remove that in that context of utility?
That's an interesting question, right? And it could even get philosophical. So gamblers will always exist. Korea has banned gambling, but gambling still happens.
Okay. Yeah.
So yeah, you can't prevent gambling, but what you can do is establish an asset that has clear utility and also has a predictable way of being compensated, right? So in particular, what that means for Luna is that it does have a clear utility and it's necessary for the security of the network. And conversely, it is compensated in a way that I would say is quite predictable. So there's two pieces of this. First, the underlying economy is e-commerce based, right? And it's an economy that is well understood. So you can look at the e-commerce partners of Terra, you can look at the number of users, and you can have a good understanding of what that growth might be and how that economy functions, right? It's a well understood market. And secondly, the way that the protocol has been designed is explicitly to make sure that Luna is compensated in a consistent way, right? Because we were very careful in making Luna as non-speculative as possible. And so in that sense, we want a miner or a validator in the system to have confidence that the Luna they buy today will compensate them in a consistent way. And the protocol actually does precisely that by calibrating transaction fees and then calibrating how fast Luna is burnt. So these are a few details we can get into later, but the basic idea is the compensation for Luna is designed to be very consistent.
I see. And what's interesting too is that despite there being a much greater propensity for the actual Luna token to have some sort of representation of value, to be something that is attractive to miners, for example. There's a real carrot for stakers as well. They're still fundamentally both utilities, both Luna and Terra. Now let's move across to Libra. It's completely different. You do not have this dual utility model. You have a very strong separation of intent. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Right, so there's Libra, then there's this thing called the Libra investment token. And to be honest, I wasn't able to find too much information. I don't think they've been too public about details.
There must be a reason why.
So basically they want Facebook users to be able to easily acquire the stablecoin and then presumably use it either for peer-to-peer payments or to purchase products, I assume.
Right, and that's what people suspect at the moment, that essentially it's a payment coin. Now, one of the things that is really interesting is the rewards themselves, Nick. You've made it very clear in some of the discussions that there are real, true and authentic incentives built in for participants in the network. But I want to talk more about Libra actually in this instance, because the money that is made in the Libra coin, where does it go?
So according to the white paper, it will be stored in custodian banks. So essentially, if I pay $1 for 1 Libra, then that $1 would be stored in some bank, generate some interest, and I think that interest is supposed to go to the members of the association. So it's in that sense, it's a way of rewarding the early investors, to my understanding. Okay,
so if the early investors are those part of that consortium, they are the conglomerates, they are the big corporations. Again, I mean, I guess it's rhetoric, but how does it really help evoke some sort of societal change or economic change?
Well, I don't think it's radical whatsoever. And in fact, something that I'm not sure they've considered, and I don't recall reading that in their paper, is how they would compensate for fluctuations with local currencies, right? Which is something we were talking about.
Right, which makes a lot of sense. So, fundamentally, it's almost ironic, given that the title is Libra. Libra means freedom. Freedom for whom?
Yeah, I think it's fair of putting it. There's nothing in the way to do it.
Maybe perhaps the more apt term would be a white collar coin, or I don't know, perhaps there's some other term, but to be fair, it doesn't sound so far from what I'm hearing from this discussion, not from your article. I'm not seeing any evidence of anything that's really overtly revolutionary. And that's really what it has to be. It has to really change the economic mantra. It has to change the economic rationale of the day. And I wonder if it is at all.
So look, Facebook is a $500 billion company, right? So many would argue this already is a pretty big gamble that they've taken. I think they're going to run into a lot of trouble for it. So I read this interesting Bloomberg piece where basically the argument was, a lot of the fiasco with Cambridge Analytica and in general the privacy concerns has been around lack of regulation. Right? So Facebook has barely been regulated. There's very little regulation when it comes to privacy. Like GDPR has been a huge thing in Europe, but I think the US is much more behind when it comes to that. And basically, if you think about the spectrum of regulation, social network privacy is on the one end that's largely unregulated, and now people are starting to talk about regulation. And then on the other end, you have financial services, right, which is probably the most regulated, one of the most regulated industries in the world.
Right.
And so, it's somewhat funny that Facebook
it is actually
is basically just running into the most regulated, one of the most regulated industries.
And Nick, I appreciate that you explained this because many of us didn't realize that, I don't think. Never really thought about just how far removed they were from this financial end of the continuum. They're literally a polar opposite in many respects, and yet suddenly they're flipping to represent money for the globe in as you said, the most regulated market on the planet, and yet they've been in this grey zone for so long.
Right. So in that sense, I think it's not surprising that they didn't shoot for something revolutionary. I mean, as I said, I think for many investors, this already can be considered an irresponsible gamble, right? A $500 billion company going after crypto,
right?
And calling on tons of regulators, lots of backlash. So I think they probably pushed the limits of what would be considered risky for their status and what their investors are comfortable with.
Got it.
But obviously, that's far removed from I think the vision that we have about permissionless money.
Yes, well, let's bring it back to that for a moment, because I mean, we could talk about Facebook forever. But with regard to one of the key assets that Terra bring, you make it really clear that Libra lack seigniorage. So can you explain to us firstly what that means, because it was a new term that I hadn't read deeply into until I read your article, and why it's so important to your whole argument when we look at Terra versus Libra?
Right, so I think seigniorage is one of those very powerful ideas that may sound a bit magical, but in reality, the idea is fairly simple, and I think it's what makes stablecoin design super exciting.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea is the following, right? So as a government or any currency issuer, let's say that I print a dollar note, right? Or I print one Brad coin, right?
Okay, one Brad coin, I like it.
Let's say that you're the central bank, right?
Okay.
So you issue one Brad coin, and let's say that one Brad coin has a market value of 10 cents. Right?
Okay.
So when you issue that currency, essentially you've just created value. Right? And then the question you need to ask is, okay, how much did that cost? So how much did it cost you to print that Brad coin? So if you're using paper money, then if you're putting it on a piece of paper, then chances are it costs almost nothing. Right? So suddenly by printing that unit of currency, you've created 10 cents of value. Mm-hmm. And so that is the value that you're able to distribute however you want, right? Because with that currency, you get to decide where it goes.
So essentially, you're acknowledging issuance costs.
Right. So essentially, seigniorage is defined as what is the value of the currency I produced after removing the cost of production.
Got it. Okay.
So traditionally, governments have used seigniorage to funnel value and money in whatever effort they think is most valuable, often just filling up their own coffers. Mm-hmm. Right? So like if you go back to the pharaohs, for example, like the pharaohs would issue currency and then they would fund the pyramids with that, right? So seigniorage is essentially a way of funneling value somewhere. Right? And
so it's almost a baseline expectation that you need to have that embedded into any currency, whether that be digital, blockchain, or traditional.
Right. So the real power is, where does that go? Right. So like if you're the pharaohs, then you're funding pyramids for that, right? But if you're a decentralized system where you have a certain vision for how you want to return value to users, then you are more like Terra, where we have a thesis for returning value to users. But let me just draw a line here to separate to explain why in the case of Libra, there is no seigniorage, right? Okay. So when you issue one Libra, let's assume that one Libra is $1, the way that Libra is doing this is it's fully backing it with fiat, right? Which would mean that for that one Libra, the $1 that it corresponds to will go to the bank. So in that sense, there is no profit, or there is no revenue generated from that process, right?
Mm-hmm.
So metaphorically speaking, it costs $1 to create that Libra, right? It's rather quite literally speaking.
Because it's just automatic. It just literally funnels back into through their model, back into, as you said, those custodial banks as the method.
Yeah.
Right.
Because for every Libra, there's, let's say, $1 backing
Mm-hmm.
it. So there is no new value being created that you're able to distribute somehow, right?
So what is the effect of that, not having that in a nutshell?
I think in a nutshell, it means that it's very hard to compete with the underlying fiat currency, right? For example, the dollar, because the moment you have to keep a bunch of money locked up, that's very high cost of capital. It's a very inefficient use of money, and it's hard to provide incremental value compared to just having plain old dollars. It's something that people ask very often, like, why would I use Libra? Why would I use Tether if I can just hold my dollar, right?
Right. Well, Nick, given that, that's a pretty substantial thing, you know, for their whole architecture. If they don't have that seigniorage, how would they operate longitudinally? How will they sustain their success if they don't have what is fundamentally appropriate for almost every currency that's existed historically?
That's an excellent question. I think Facebook is sitting on a ton of cash, and so my guess is either them or collectively the association will have to spend a lot of cash to make this attractive, to acquire users, but that fundamentally doesn't scale, right? It will be extremely expensive to create users and incentives. I think that's where we tie into how Terra works with this idea of seigniorage. So rather than having billions in cash coffered, the way Terra is designed is when, let's say, 1 Terra is issued, and let's again use the example of 1 USD. Let's say that 1 Terra corresponds to $1 US, then part of that Terra is used to reward miners for the work that they do for the network and for helping stabilize Terra. And then part of that value is returned to users. Right? And the idea there is, let's say it's 50-50 for, to make things simple. So if half a Terra is issued, or if 1 Terra is issued, then half of that would be credited to users of Terra to reward them for the fact that they're contributing to growth. Right? So that could come in the form of cashback. It could come in the form of a discount. So the idea is when demand for Terra increases, because we're assuming now that there is reason to print that Terra. Right? Terra is only issued when demand goes up. So if more people want Terra and you get to issue some more, then part of that will reward users for being part of the network.
And I think that if we hark back to, you know, that analogy I made before about white collar, we can also, you know, use the argument of the blue collar just for an analogy for a moment, because if someone's doing the work, if they're contributing to this network, they deserve a reward for that. That you offer that through this system of money. Libra doesn't. Not to the blue collar. There is no blue collar. But in your model, if someone does the work, they contribute to that staking, as a validator, they get rewarded.
Yeah, I think that's it's a nice way of putting it. So I wouldn't say that we intend to be populist, but I do think that we've designed a fair system that will return value to the people that help grow the economy.
And what about preclusions? Have you made it easy for people to access the network to get those rewards in comparison to clearly significant preclusions from Libra?
Yeah, so anyone can join the network as a validator to help with the consensus, and they are rewarded for that service. And then right now we're building a network of e-commerce companies that will be accepting Terra as a means of payment. And as of 10 days ago, it's being used already by 100,000 users in Korea. And all of those have received, I forget the number, but there's a substantial amount of discounts that we've already offered through Seigniorage.
Right.
And this is something that will be growing very fast.
So I remember reading that actually, Nick, and I thought to myself, wow, maybe you've got this first mover advantage because you've actually got evidence now that you're a utility and almost, you know, you're a currency operating essentially in its way. So you have, you know, your mainnet's out 2 months ago. So are you ahead of the game?
Well, evidently, right? So Libra just released their white paper and it's still completely on the conceptual stage. I think it's not just a matter of them actually launching the network, but more so, I think the biggest question marks have to do with regulation and them getting the requisite licenses and even them not getting cease and desists from governments saying that they need to shut this down. So for them to overcome all those hurdles from becoming more friendly to governments all the way to actually acquiring licenses, I think that is going to take a fairly long amount of time.
Right.
So I think they're quite far, to be honest.
Sure. Now let's talk about Asia for a moment. We were discussing this at the beginning, but clearly many of the different countries in the Asian belt are very pro-blockchain. Not all of them are pro-crypto, I'll say, but certainly even in Korea, there's some, concerns there. But there is this huge push for blockchain innovation. So in that respect, do you feel like you're the best, you're best positioned, you're best situated, literally geographically, to really build this out? To go global, do you need to essentially be in this Asian hub to start?
Well, I think it has massive advantages, right? So as you pointed out, not just Korea, but in general, I'd say adoption of new technology is, in this part of the world, is very rapid, right? Just people are very hungry for the latest stuff. Blockchain in particular, as you said, is very much respected and people have a lot of excitement around it. And so I'd say on the one hand, you have this blockchain trend and this desire to use cutting-edge technology that is definitely a big positive factor. On the other end, something that I think is at least as important is the growth of e-commerce in East Asia and Southeast Asia even more so. So if you look at our underlying economy and what will contribute to growth, it's precisely the e-commerce market. Right? Mm-hmm. And in general, payments, e-commerce, mobile commerce even more so, are growing very rapidly in the region. So in Korea alone, I think, which is at this point a very developed nation, we're looking at, I think, roughly 15% year-over-year growth of the e-commerce market. In Southeast Asia, we're looking at much crazier numbers, so on the order of 35 to 40%, which is just unheard of for a developed economy, right? Because those economies, so if you look at Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines, their growth is astounding. So they're growing. That region is one of the two fastest growing regions economically speaking in the world. The other is some nations in the north of Africa, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, it's good that you know this stuff because obviously you're following along to make sure that you can tap into some of these markets in the future, Nick.
Yeah, so it really is a special place to be launching new technology. Right? You're riding a wave of economic growth and in particular commerce growth and mobile payments growth that is one of the strongest economic forces in the world right now. And you almost get it for free if you're positioned at the right place at the right time.
Right. Well, obviously you have the support of many of the different regions given already this e-commerce venture that you're rolling out. Have you had any barriers though? Have you had any of this situation where some of these government parties are up in arms because of the potential challenges to the sovereign currencies of these regions?
So we've been extremely careful to be fully compliant with every jurisdiction that we want to enter to. And I'd say that is likely one of the largest challenges, right? So looking ahead, talking to all the relevant parties and making sure that what we do is fully within the bounds of the law.
Right.
And yeah, I think that this takes a lot of time. We are already in active development of relationships in many other countries. So we already have lots of e-commerce partnerships, but then there's a long list of things you need to do, including getting licenses and making sure that you're fully regulated across the board.
Got it.
And yeah, that takes time, but I think the moment you can hit that is the moment you...
Well, clearly, Nick, you're already way ahead of the game when it comes to just the sheer number of countries you're talking to. Again, not to FOMO or to really try. I know in this interview we're leaning more towards Terra, but that's just because the reality is you're much more developed in terms of your position as what you stand by, and that is to be this global stable currency. But there was a bit of a nuance in your article to suggest that it could be in some ways the Eastern coin, for commerce. But given the nascent time that we're in, and given that it's only at a white paper for Libra, would it be fairer to say this is just the beginning and you could easily merge into the Western markets and and thus become truly global?
Absolutely. The Terra never had an intent on purely being Eastern or purely being Asian. I think Asia is an excellent place to start for the reasons we mentioned, right? Extremely high growth, very strong tailwinds, but our vision is absolutely global. And I think that the moment you dominate the Asian market, you definitely have advantages and reasons to be able to.
Right. Well, what about the companies, Nick? You've seen the companies listed for Libra. They're international. They're major corporations. Can you trump that, or can you come up with some names of like standing, of like reputation, of like size as well, to really showcase that you're also partnering with some serious names?
Well, to be honest with you, I think this isn't really a game of who can enlist the biggest or coolest companies. Right?
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to real world adoption, it's about creating a currency that people want to use and it returns value to them. So at this point, we have partnerships with e-commerce companies with more than 50 million users in aggregate. And it's actually something that we were able to achieve only within the first, I think, less than a year of our operation. Mm-hmm. So yeah, rather than getting a big board of names that may or may not be actively participating at all, we've partnered with real businesses who will be using Terra.
Right. So what's the plan for the rest of the year, Nick? You know a lot more than us with regard to what's in the roadmap, just simply for the e-commerce aspect. Give us a bit of a rundown on just the kind of magnitude that this could evolve to just in the next half of the year.
So we already put a big dent in one of the second largest actually e-commerce company in Korea. And so we have a roadmap for several integrations with e-commerce companies in Korea for the remaining half of the year. And at the same time, as I said, we're very actively developing the next steps for jumping into Singapore, jumping into Thailand. And after that, we're looking at Indonesia, we're looking at Vietnam. And I think we're much closer to both Thailand and Singapore. And so I expect that by the end of the year, we'll be much more set up there and we'll be ready to launch e-commerce partnerships there, either towards Q4 or beginning of 2020.
Well, it's a lot happening, Nick. I mean, clearly you're making waves already, literally in the business frame. What about the actual access to the token though, Nick? I mean, you have two of them, Luna, Terra. One is designed to be essentially stable, so it's not something that should be really attractive to a speculator, fundamentally. But Luna is a different story because of its staking model. How can people participate if they wanted to? In terms of exchanges, is there an agenda or interest in trying to list these coins? What's going on there?
So Luna is already trading on the third largest exchange in Korea. It's called Crypto. And we plan to be listing with the top two ones, I believe, in the near future. So we want to have want there to be full access in the Korean market for Luna. And shortly after that, definitely within the next 6 months, we plan to also expand globally when it comes to exchanges. So actually, 4 of the world's largest exchanges are all investors. So Binance is an investor, Binance Labs, rather, which is their venture arm. Mm-hmm. Then we have OKX, we have Gobi, and we also have Upbit as an investor. So Upbit is the largest exchange in Korea. And so I think it doesn't, while I don't want to foreshadow any facts and I'm making no predictions here, I wouldn't be shocked if several global exchanges.
I wouldn't be either, Nick. I mean, it makes sense. I mean, recently we saw Algorand do everything in a day. I'm not going to suggest that, but certainly the indicators are, given the magnitude of your venture, given already you're starting to prove yourself in the whole purpose of being not just for e-commerce, but to be a viable means of transaction for money or globally. You're already doing it. That's what's remarkable about it, is we're literally talking about post-mainnet with you. Libra, we're talking about something very different. So in that respect, what are the challenges, with regard to the future for you? Given that you're seeing now big brands come out, the challenge of Libra is certainly there with regard to their clout, with their money. They're extremely powerful when it comes to kind of capital they bring. Are there any challenges you foresee in this context?
Right. So I'd say one of the biggest ones is what we touched upon previously, which is making sure that we're fully compliant with regulation, and operating within a framework that is fully within the bounds of the law, while still doing our best to grow as fast as we can and delivering value to users in a way that's appropriate.
Absolutely.
So the first is that, and I'd say the second is just moving very fast, right? So I think it would be naive to dismiss Libra as a project that has no hopes, right? I think there are many limitations to it, but bottom line is Facebook is a huge company with a very global presence. And so if they do push this very hard, which does remain to be seen, I'm not sure how top of mind this is in their corporate priorities. It very well could be. And so in that sense, they could eventually be a formidable competitor.
Right. Well, one of the things I want to touch on there, in the beginning of the interview, you alluded to the kind of influence that Libra's had on the entire crypto space. You know, can you give us a bit of an indicator on what you mean there, or what we were trying to allude to, given that recently we've seen BTC rise substantially?
Right. So I think the most interesting quote I have there is, shortly before our interview, I saw this article about the G7. So that's the 7 most developed economies in the world are developing a stablecoin task force.
Okay.
So that's what was fascinating. Obviously, this was inspired by Libra. And I was thinking to myself, you know, like 2 years ago, barely anyone knew what a stablecoin was. A year ago, only people in crypto knew what a stablecoin was. And now today, the G7 is establishing a task force on stablecoins.
That's amazing. You know, that just goes to show that we are a force to be reckoned with in crypto. Because if they're starting to pay attention, they understand that we're literally in that flippening, you know, to use that analogy from crypto, into credibility. You know, that really there is something to the blockchain.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think in that sense, they've definitely given global prominence to what has been going on for many, many years at this point. And also I think that for better or for worse, they probably for the better, I think they will be a means for your average user around the world to get easy access to the crypto realm without having to go through the painful KYC of whichever local exchange is being used right now. So I think in that sense, Libra could be a liquidity medium so that people from all around the world can get easier access to things like Bitcoin and Ethereum and so on.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so in that sense, I think, again, this is purely speculative, but my assumption is that the crypto markets have taken that into account in looking at a big potential influx of new funds and new money into the space.
I certainly agree, and it also coincides with Algorand's release. We're seeing a lot of discussions and questions about the injection of traditional money, of corporate money coming in now. So it's an exciting time to see. We're certainly seeing something reflected in the growth recently. But just going back to the fundamental premise of this discussion, thank you very much, Nick, for explaining more about what you're doing as the head researcher for Terra. And also, you know, thanks for your transparency about and your openness about commenting on some of the things about Libra and what they're doing through your own perception. I really appreciate it. You made the really important point that it's not all doom and gloom for them necessarily. There's one thing they have certainly brought to the space, and that is attention, which is an invaluable commodity in itself. But one thing's for sure is that when it comes to evidenced, empirically evidenced stablecoins that can operate as currencies, you're doing it right now. You are post-mainnet. You are using e-commerce as one clear example that it can be done. And this is just the first innings for you, mate. There's a lot more to come.
A very good time. So I'm very excited for us and also for the crypto space and the broader markets in general, because I think there's a lot more to come from crypto.
Absolutely.
To get it used, but look forward to any other project that is able to make crypto more usable.
100%. I couldn't agree more. Well, Nick Platias, thank you very much as the head researcher for your time today. I thank you. If you'd like to know more, make sure you look at the description below. There'll be all the links for you about Terra Money. And certainly if you'd like to know more from the team, don't hesitate to contact Nick. I'm sure that through Telegram and the different social media channels, you can access both he and the team. But on behalf of all the people who want to know more about crypto, thanks for your time, Nick, and thanks for certainly educating us more about Terra.
My pleasure, Brad.